Hey, welcome to Simplifying LLM Interactions with LangChain and LangGraph. Where did LangChain come from? So what happened was that the CEO, Harrison Chase, when the OpenAI and the LLM models started coming out, they were coming out fast and furious, and there were a lot of things that it needed to plug in and interact with. So he developed this framework for chaining the prompts together. And basically, he originated that he was writing a lot of glue code and a lot of repetitive code trying to keep up with this. So he decided to build a framework around it. And so some of the key features are that it has a very modular design. So it's easy to add and remove components. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. It goes beyond actually just the language models. And then it also simplifies the operations. So things like creating a workflow, just like when using Chat GPT or Claude directly, what you may do is you may create a prompt and you get a response back. Then you may edit that prompt or you have to reformat it. And then you feed that into another prompt and you might chain two or three of these things together. And at the end of it, you have a response. LangChain basically will manage that and handle that in the back end for you. Run the LLM, you have an output, you have the opportunity to reformat that output and then pass it along to the next step in the chain. LangChain will manage all that in the back end for you, filling in variables and things like that. So it's very cool. And then as more and more agents are being developed, they develop LangGraph. LangGraph is a state machine that handles multiple agents, multiple states of the agents, and a little bit of persistence. And again, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but these two pieces together, I just can't tell you how I am as a developer. It's made my life so much easier to have LangChain and now LangGraph in my repertoire. If you look at OpenAI, its code doesn't look too complicated, but you have to do some setup. You have to set the language for the prompt, and then you have to set up the prompt. And you can see in Python, you actually have to go and fill in the prompt into the string. And so now you have the prompt, you can feed that to the LLM. And so the interesting thing is that if you look at OpenAI, its structure is a little bit different. It's chat, system role, user role. And then with Claude, it's client messages create. And then when you get the response back, you see at the bottom for OpenAI, it's choices and it's an array, message content. And for Claude, it's content. So even though it's not very difficult, if you were always just using Claude, this probably wouldn't be a problem. But what we're seeing more and more is that as the models change, you'd like to build more of a plug and play architecture. And also you could even swap out the models based on a user. So configuration options. And if you test the models, you'll see they get different responses from the different models. So it's nice to be able to pull that information out into some way that you could configure it. And I'll show you some working code later. But if you look at it, you're probably thinking, Marty, seriously, I mean, the LangChain thing looks a little more complicated. But what it is it's just standardizing some of the things. So it doesn't matter what the model is at the top. In this case, I was showing OpenAI, and it has a system template. And then they have things called prompt templates. And the prompt templates are things that LangChain works on in the back end, massages them, and then feeds them to the LLM. And then you have an output parser so you can manage the structure of the output. If you wanted to do any of that in native, calling the API for OpenAI or for Claude or any of the other models, when you get the response back, you then have to do something with it, like maybe convert it to JSON or something like that. So these are things to think about. And these are some of the reasons why going with LangChain or a framework like that are pretty good. And so then what happens is, no matter what model you're using, the structure of the code looks the same. If there are multiple developers working in the application, it starts to look very similar. So it doesn't matter the model you're using, the calls and the code is going to look pretty much the same. That's a great thing. And then they came up with this LangChain expression language, which basically pipes the information together. So it's a very condensed format of a chain. And once you get used to it, it's very clean. It looks good and it cuts down the number of lines of code. So for readability and debugging, it's just killer. So here's the general structure of LangChain. You have LangChain and LangGraph at the base, and then there's this set of integrations. And I want to talk about these integrations because this is where the power of LangChain just gets exponential. At the base layer, with wrapping the language models is very cool. But when you get into the integrations, it's just taking it to a next level. LangGraph Cloud, that's their cloud environment for deploying into production. You probably have cloud-based AWS, something like that. I'm not sure the cloud is going to grow, but we'll keep you up to date on that. It's kind of new for them. And then Linesmith is their debugging platform, which is very cool. We weren't going to get into that now, but in one of the future courses, we'll go into depth Linesmith and why it's so interesting. And so, like I mentioned, all models, this is just a sampling of AI models that it wraps currently. And so just a bunch of them. And so from scalability and flexibility standpoint, you have integrations with things like vector databases. So the interface to Pinecone or MongoDB or Snowflake are all almost exactly similar. And even in cases where you're filtering data for your queries, so that's an added bonus. I was able to swap between Pinecone and MongoDB in about 3 minutes. And then long-term memory, they have connectors and integration for different long-term memory applications, document loaders, everything you can think of. It even loads things like Note, also Obsidian and things like that. So it's just pretty good. And then multiple output formats. You can format in just about anything you want. Then you can also create custom formatters. And then from a scalability standpoint, things like if you take your vector database and convert it to a retriever in LangChain, then you have all kinds of helper methods to do similarity searches and things like that. LangGraph is really their answer to agents. Before, basically, you would just trust the LLM to drive the agent. You create tools and trust the LLM to drive it the right way. But then you had to iterate into the LLM. Wasn't very good with state management. You had to handle that yourself. It was still very good for like kind of a directed graph, but for more robust agent applications, LangGraph is really the thing that you want to get into. And we'll talk about that in the future. And LangChain and LangGraph, awesome tools. If you haven't started using them, I've used them both in Python and in JavaScript, and they've just been a game changer for me.